Thank you. Yes, for 12 years I worked with manuscript collections in St. Petersburg, Russia. Then I left and now I'm doing my dissertation in Germany, and I live in Germany. And my dissertation is dedicated to Tibetan Buddhism in the Tangut state. But our today's topic is not directly derives from my dissertation interest.
Recording in progress.
It is a side project, and with my supervisor, Marta Cernezi, we read different sources related to the history of Tanguts in Tibetan language. And one of the stories was so exciting that I decided to dedicate a lecture to it. I don't know how much people in the audience know about the Tanguts, maybe some random facts, or approximately when did they live, and how to say hello in Tangut. But of course, in my presentation, I will use the work of other scholars. I did not do all of that myself, but in order to make it easier to apprehend, I tried to use as little of names and dates as possible, but of course we cannot talk about the Tanguts entirely without names. So in the first part I will try to explain who were the Tanguts and what are the sources for Tangut studies, for Tangutology. Then we will talk about the source for our today's lecture, about the Red Annals, and what in particular can it tell us about the Tangut history. And finally, we will explore some ancient stories, some fairy tales about the origins of the Tangut ruling clan. So, the Tanguts derived from the Dansan tribes that lived in the upper reaches of the river Huanghe, the Yellow River, near the Kukunor, Qinghai Lake. These are the modern provinces of Gansu, Qinghai, partly Ningxia-Hui autonomous region. And they began to emerge on the historical scene approximately in the 6th, 7th centuries. The Dansan were one of the many ignorant peoples who did animal husbandry and were engaged in wars. And in order to survive, they sided with the Tibetan Empire, they sided with the Chinese, and they needed to maneuver in order to survive, and that's what they did. There were many political actors around them and around the future Tanguts. Besides the Tibetans and the Chinese, there were also the Uyghurs. Later emerged dynasties and states of the Jurchen, of the Khitans, and Tanguts also emerged in this very vibrant historical atmosphere. So, the first person who ascended and brought the Dansan tribes further to the success was Toba Segun. This name is taken from the Chinese historiography. That's why it sounds Chinese. Toba is the name of the clan, a ruling clan, possibly of Sanbi origin. And the tribes of Dansan, future Tanguts, were slowly consolidating under the rule of this Toba clan and emerging as a political, historical entity. And Toba Segun, he helped the Tang dynasty to fight with Huan Chao, who rebelled against the Tang dynasty, and grateful Chinese gave him the title of Wan, the king, and the royal surname. It's surname Li, if I'm not mistaken. So, thanks to this, the Dansan obtained a higher status, and they were not yet independent, but they could act as vassals of the Chinese. They were still illiterate, still doing animal husbandry, but interacting with the Chinese civilization, they slowly started to acquire different skills, such as agriculture, and they were also engaged in the salt trade because the geography of the places where they lived was favorable for it. Then the son of Toba Segun, Toba Dzityan, used the political situation in his favor because the next dynasty, the Sun, was weakened by the fight with the Khitans, with the Liao, and he rebelled, and he managed to use the situation in his advantage, and he also received some benefits from the Chinese and also a royal surname. And in the times of Toba Dzityan, the Sun, the Chinese, recognized de facto independence of the Tangut state because they did not have enough resource to subdue them. But still, the Tanguts were not a totally independent unit on the political scenes. That happened later when the grandson of the Toba Segun and son of the Toba Dzityan, Toba Demin, posthumously granted his father an imperial title. And I would ask you to try to remember these first names, Toba Segun and Toba Dzityan, because we will need them later in the final part of our lecture. So the Tanguts became a new empire, and they made their own administration, created according to the Chinese fashion, and they moved the capital and started different political and economical processes. And they started to expand to the west. So they annexed the Uyghur kingdom, and even the place where the oasis of Don Juan is situated. Don Juan is a famous place where the caves of 1,000 Buddhas are, and also it was a crucial point in the Silk Road, and that is how the Tanguts accessed the Silk Road and possibilities to trade. So they were very swiftly expanding, and you can see on this map that they started in this small violet spot, then they annexed this blue territory, and the brown spot is what they achieved by the middle of the 11th century. Toba Demin's son, Li Yuanhao, proclaimed himself the emperor of Western Xia, and that is how the Tangut Empire came finally and officially into existence. It was called Western Xia or Xixia in Chinese because it was situated to the west from the Sun. But Tanguts did not call themselves Tanguts. Tangut is a Mongolian and Turkic word. They called themselves Minya and some other terms. And they called their own state not Xixia, but the kingdom of the great Xia, of the white and lofty. And that is how beautifully it looks written in the Tangut script. White and Lofty deals with the ancestral beliefs of the Tanguts, and it is a very complicated topic, and I will not delve into it at the moment. They tried to evolve their own culture, and in a very short period of time, they devised their own script based on the Chinese characters that consists of more than 6,000 characters. That is much less than the repertoire of the Chinese language has. And the emperor himself supervised the creation of this script. Most of Tangut logograms consist of about 10 strokes, but usually the number of strokes does not exceed 20 and is very rarely fewer than 5. And these characters look very menacing for me. And when I started to learn Tangut language, I thought that probably the Tibetan language would help me, but it didn't happen because although the Tangut language belongs to the Sino-Tibetan family, to the Tibeto-Burman group, the ways of the Tibetan language and the Tangut, they went different directions like 3,000 years ago, so Tibetan did not help me much. But gradually I keep learning it, and this summer in Vienna I took express course of Tangut in 2 weeks, but I still cannot call myself a Tangutologist, of course, though I aspire to be one. So they created a very complex culture. They translated texts from the Chinese, from Tibetan. They were a multinational state because besides the Tanguts themselves, there were Chinese communities, Tibetan communities, Uyghur communities, and all of this we know from historiography and from the law codes, because the life of these different communities was also regulated by laws. And finally, in the 13th century, the state of the Western Xia was destroyed by Genghis Khan, and surviving Tanguts were assimilated by Chinese and Tibetan populations. It didn't happen like in the blink of an eye, because Tanguts keep working at the Mongol Yuan court. They were still engaged in literary activities. They were making translations, and but they did not engage in politics, and they did not exist as an independent political and historical actor anymore. But the politics of the next Chinese dynasty, the Ming, was different, and they expelled Romanian Tanguts from the historical territories that were occupied by Chinese immigrants, and due to that politics, Tanguts finally were dissolved among the Tibetans and the Chinese. So the language and the script became extinct by 16th century already. Nobody besides Chinese historiographers probably remembered of them, but the discovery of the Tangut city that is called in Mongolian Harahoto, a black city, gave a great impetus to the development of the Tangut studies in the beginning of the 20th century, when the Russian traveler Petr Kozlov heard from the Buryat trader and scholar Tsokta Badmazhapov about the existence of an abandoned, ruined city somewhere in the desert of Gobi. And this discovery led to unexpected consequences, because the library of hundreds and thousands of texts and small fragments was found there. Mainly these texts were in Tangut, also in the Chinese and in Tibetan. And the majority of them was brought to St. Petersburg, Russia, and next expeditions led by the British explorers and then by the Chinese scholars took the remains, and such collections also can be found in London and in China, in Mongolia. So these sources are the primary sources that allow us to study the life of the Tangut state, of the Tangut society. Mostly these are Buddhist texts, but also there are law codes and documents, but unfortunately no historical works, and we don't know if they existed, if the Tanguts wrote the history themselves. Because the city of Harahoto, it is at the very north of the map, Heishui Commandery Harahoto. It was not a capital, it was not even a major city of the Western Xia. It was just a military outpost on the borders of the empire, and this bulk of documents that was found by Kozlov and his successors, it is just a collection mainly of Buddhist contents that survived centuries in the Gobi Desert by chance. And we can assume that the majority or all the libraries and archives of the Tanguts themselves, they just perished during the conflicts when the Tangut state was taken by the Mongolian troops. But besides this, we also have Chinese historiography. When the Mongolian dynasty Yuan came into power, they created a commission at court, and that commission should have decided which histories they should issue, because when one dynasty ceases to exist, it is the obligation of the historians of the actual next dynasty to write the history of their predecessors. And of course, they compiled the history of the Sun. They decided that they should also write the history of Liao, of Khitans, and they compiled the history of Jurchens, of the Jin. But talking about the Tanguts, the Mongolian historians, the Yuan historians, decided that they do not worth their own history. And I think it's not fair, because culturally and historically they are not inferior to the Khitans and Jurchens. But anyway, such decision was made, and no individual history of the Tanguts was created at the Yuan court. But some short summaries were included into the histories of these three as information about the foreign peoples that surrounded the Sun, the Jin, and Liao. And of course, by that time, when Chinese historians did it, many Tanguts were still alive, and many Tangut sources were probably still accessible. And some Chinese sources that later could not be found were used, but only to a limited extent, because obviously the historians also had very strict deadlines, and they could not use all the information available to them. They had to cut and shorten their resources. Of course, later Chinese historians could not live with the idea that the history of the Western Xia does not exist, and they attempted to recreate it using sources available to them, including these dynasty histories and other sources that are not available to us anymore. And two prominent examples that I can name are recorded events of the Western Xia, Xixia Shushi, and the encyclopedia of the Tangut life, culture, and history called Xixia Di, that very accurately retells and presents us all the available information that its author could obtain by the beginning of the 20th century. These histories are very important, but they reflect these aspects of the Tangut history that were important to the Chinese official position. I mean, the conflicts, the wars, and different names of the rulers and political events. Of course, they were not so concerned about the culture, culture, economy, and needless to say about the folklore and some legends and imperial narratives that the Tanguts themselves produced. That's why we can also turn to the Tibetan sources that are not so numerous as the Chinese ones, but they give us another side of the story. Tibetans played an important role in the Tangut state because Tibetan Buddhism was very important, and one of the Tangut emperors even knew Tibetan because some of the texts Buddhist texts had to be read in Tibetan, and in the Tangut law codes there are regulations which texts one had to memorize in Tibetan language in order to secure a certain position in a monastic community. And we can learn something about the Tibetan history, for example, from the biographies of the Tibetan scholars and monks who visited Tangut state at that time. For example, it is the biography of T. Sri Repa, who became the national preceptor of the Tangut state. And these biographies, they of course tell us the narratives about the Buddhist teachings, about the meetings of these Buddhist figures with the rulers, about the revelations and the dreams they had. But also we can find there some historical information. And another very important source in that regard is a historical work written by Tselpa Künga Dorje in the 14th century. Tselpa Künga Dorje was a representative of a powerful family that was connected to the Mongols, and he lived at very interesting times because just 100 years ago Mongols subdued Tibet, and starting from that time the fragmented territory where the Tibetans live and the Tibetan society started to feel this urge for unification, for like national, for the development of national consciousness. And Tselpa Künga Dorje wrote his historical work when all this processes happened. He sometimes is compared to Bhutan Rinchen Dup, a famous compiler of the catalogue of the Buddhist works that is also known as Kanjur and Danjur. He codified all the existing translations from Sanskrit and Tibetan works that became part of the Tibetan Buddhist canon. And Tselpa Künga Dorje was also a person of the same level. He had access to many documents. He had access to royal archives, and at that time the Tanguts were still alive, so he obviously could have interviewed Tangut people like alive. So he could talk to people and not just rely on the written sources. I read Annals is a typical work of Buddhist historiography. It consists of 3 parts. The first part is how the Buddhism in India emerged, because probably you know that for Tibetan historiographers, history is a history of Buddhist teaching, not of the society or the rulers, but the Buddhist aspect comes to the first place. So the first part is dedicated to India and to the birth of Buddha Shakyamuni. The second part is dedicated to the Chinese dynasties. And the last part is the history of Tibet proper. And in this rather small second part, along with the Chinese history and along with the history of the Mongols, we find the short history of the Tangut state and the emergence of Buddhism in the Tangut state. And this account, I found it very interesting, and I decided to dedicate a special talk to it. So now I will tell you a fairy tale, and you may fall asleep. In the past, all the lands of Tanguts were under control of China, and there lived on a mountain a local deity called Sihu, or Gahu, who is considered to be a legendary ancestor of the Tangut Empire. And this deity possessed wrathful powers. He turned himself into the 7 horsemen, and this group of horsemen headed to a fortress. And the leader of the group met a woman there and had relationships with her. And after 1 year, a boy was born from that relationship. And at that time, a star appeared in the sky, and the astrologers at the court of the emperor, we can assume that it was the court of the Chinese emperor, told him that somewhere in the fortress a man was born who will usurp the power. But the Chinese emperor was not as brutal as people in the Bible, so he first asked the astrologers to make more calculations and to find out where exactly this boy is. But a certain old woman took the baby and put him in a cavity in the earth, maybe in a pit, and covered this pit with a wooden plank or board. And then she placed a pot full of water on top of it. And when astrologers made their calculations, they probably could have seen only the elements of the dispositions. They could see water, fire, wood, and earth. So they replied that the boy is underground, he is beneath a tree in the ocean. And this reply was, of course, nonsensical. So the Chinese emperor, in order to be safe and to avoid the usurpation of power, he ordered to kill all the infants in the neighborhood who were under 2 years old. But the same old woman took the baby, and pretending that he was dead, she put him into a box or a casket, and carried him to the river, and she left him among the reeds. But he did not. The box did not swim anywhere. It stayed where it was, and a vulture, eagle-like bird, came to this boy to warm it with his wings to protect it from cold, and another animal, a cow, also was passing by regularly, feeding the boy with milk. So here we come to the attempt to explain of the name of the ruling clan of the Tanguts, that is Ngwemi, and to interpret it as another two characters that have similar transcription, Ngwenu, character that means cow and character that means to give milk. And our Tibetan historical works give us explanation that the name of the clan translates into Tibetan as the one who drinks the milk, who drinks milk from the cow. So that is the attempt of creating a folk etymology, but we will return to it later. And there was another old lady who was the owner of the cow, and she was curious where her cow is going regularly, and she came with the cow to check and saw this boy and decided, oh, this boy is definitely special, I will adopt him. And so she raised this future emperor of the Tangut state as his own son. Then you remember that the ancestor, the father of this boy, was a local deity who turned himself into 7 horsemen, and leader of this group was the actual father of this magical child. But obviously, the other 6 horsemen also had families in the vicinity, because in total there were 7 boys, and when our protagonist reached the age of 7, he looked for another 6 persons, so they again became the group of 7. And although they were only 7 years old, they went to the mountains, they captured people who were living there, who were gathering wood, and turned them into rebels. So that's how the rebellious army of Tanguts was emerged. Of course, we should not take it literally, because number 7 has many mythical and folklore connotations, and it can be found in the folklore of Mongolian peoples, in the epic of Geser, and obviously it was important to the Tangut culture also. The future leader of the Tangut state, he came to the fortress where he was born in order to consult with clever and wise people how to organize the rebellion. And again, the old woman gave him a good advice. She told him, please collect as much of horse whips as possible and horse dung, and throw it into the river on the certain day of the month. And then I will make it so that the seal of the Chinese emperor will fall into your hands. And this old lady, she ascended the rampart, the wall of the fortress, and she began beating her chest and crying. And the emperor was surprised and sent a man to ask what's happening. And the old woman replied that according to God Indra's behest, the emperor of Tanguts was born and raised, and he is approaching, and we should subdue to him, we should take his side. And of course, the emperor wanted some proof of this statement, and she replied, look at the river, because the river completely changed its color because of horse whips and horse dung floating in it. And that was true. And the people inside the fortress were really scared that the immeasurable army is approaching. So they decided it's better not to fight and to subdue. And they sent a delegation of the 7 ministers and the emperor with a seal in order to pass the seal into the hands of the conqueror. But the treacherous leader of the Tanguts simply killed all of them, took the seal, and took the fortress. And that is how, according to this legend, the history of the Tangut state began. So if we summarize the biography of this legendary leader, he originated from a mountain deity that turned himself into 7 horsemen. Then there was a star prophecy that the person that will usurp power in the empire was born. Then the astrologers were defeated by rules of an old woman who put the boy into a pit and covered him with a plank and put a pot filled with water on top of it. Then all the babies in the neighborhood were killed. Our miraculous boy was hidden in a basket and carried to the river. And animals and birds, namely vulture, who warmed the boy with his wings, and the cow who gave milk to the boy, they took care of him. And then we are told the story of the usurpation of power itself, how the boy gathered troops and defeated the Chinese emperor and the inhabitants of the fortress through a ruse, whips and manure floating in a river. So we could ask ourselves if we could believe this story, and how, to what extent we can consider it trustworthy. And the cons and pros are the following. The main argument against believing it is an account recorded based on the words of a single individual and relate to a Tibetan historian. Although this person was a Tangut himself, he was not a professional historiographer. He could just be a simple person, and he could invented something and distorted something. But arguments pro are that the Red Annals, the Depter Marpo, and their compiler, Künga Dorje, they have great authority. And there are some correspondence with other sources. For example, there are Tangut odes, and the Tangut odes are a very specific genre of Tangut literature, found written on the back of Tangut block prints. So it is a poetry that has also came down to us by chance. And these are the products of authentic Tangut cultural thought. And in these odes, for example, we can learn about the legendary ancestors of the peoples. Later, his sons and grandsons flourished everywhere, and the Tangut Sihu appeared. So this name coincides with the name of the local deity that turned himself into the 7 horsemen. Even before his birth, he had 2 teeth. he grew up and mastered all 10 auspicious signs. Accompanied by 7 riders, he arrived to become emperor. And the red annals also give us very similar name of the ancestor Sihu, and tell us that he turned himself into seven horsemen. And we should get back to the emergence of the Tangut state and to these 2 names, Toba Segun and Toba Ditian. Because both these persons are somehow related to the history we are told in the Red Annals. Both of them rebelled against the Chinese. Both of them subdued fortresses. And Toba Segun, and I remind you that it's a Chinese transcription, partially phonetically coincides with the name Sihu. But concerning the second, his son Toba Ditian, he, as Chinese historiography tells us, he, with a group of his supporters, he fled to the steppe and rallied the Tanguts to fight for independence. So he raised the peoples for in order to organize rebellion against the Chinese. And the Tangut tribes readily supported him, and he successfully struggled. So the accounts of both of these people partially coincide with what we find in the Tibetan source. And also Toba Ditian, according to the Chinese sources, was born with teeth. He emerged from his mother's womb with teeth. So, of course, we should not seek historical accuracy in the Tibetan source, but it is interesting how these facts overlap, and it makes us believe that, at least partially, what we find in the Red Annals is trustworthy. Then we can turn to the problem of the explanation of the name of the Tangut ruling clan, Ngwemi, and to think if it's a folk etymology or a deliberately created construct. And one can have impression of the later option, that this explanation was created deliberately, because of course, you recognized in this story a motif of the exposed child that has many sub-motifs, namely star prophecy, massacre of the innocents, baby in a basket, and animals and birds taking care of the deity. And this motif was extremely widespread, and one of its aspects, animals and birds taking care of a baby, significantly could be found in the biography of the founder of the state of Ptolemaic state, Ptolemy the first Soter, who was abandoned by his mother and exposed on a bronze shield, and a visiting male eagle, stretching his wings under the baby and raising itself, sheltered him from the scorching rays of the sun and the excessive rains. In such stories, the animal or a bird should not also protect, but also feed and nourish the baby. And in the case of Ptolemy, the eagle feeds the baby with his blood. But in the case of the Tangut emperor, we have a cow fulfilling this nourishing function. But this coincidence with the episode of the Western history and mythical background is significant because male eagle obviously is associated with Zeus, and probably these motifs found the way to the Tangut cultural sphere through the Silk Road. And we can speculate that the cow feeding a baby is also not an original invention and not a story developed on a folk etymology, but appropriation of a motif spread among the Iranian peoples. For example, Feridun, an Iranian mythical king and hero who is a hero of Shahnameh, was raised by a cow whom he suckled for 3 years. And this Feridun's cow is also an important actor of the Iranian epic and mythical folkloric texts. The motif of exposed child and abandoned baby is extremely popular, and one of the first, and probably the first example of its usage is the story of Sargon, the mighty king, Sargon of Akkad, who was the founder of the Akkadian Empire and probably the first emperor ever in the history of humanity. And he told this story, maybe not he, but somewhere somewhere from his retinue, he told the story in the inscription where he explains that his mother was a Vestal and he did not know his father, and his mother brought him to a hidden place and laid him in a vessel made of reeds. And this story is to a greater extent repeated by what happened to Moses and dozens of other characters in the history of humanity. But notably, Feridun, whom he talked about before, also had to undergo the same situation because Zohak, his rival and his enemy, was warned in a dream that a certain child will appear to dethrone him, and he is searching for him, but his mother hides Feridun in the forest, and he is suckled by a cow there. So, to conclusions. The legend from the Red Annals that we analyzed today has no exact parallels in other known sources, although it contains minor similarities with Chinese historiography and Tangut odes. This legend gives the impression of not being spontaneously formed, but rather a deliberately constructed narrative aimed at legitimizing the power of the ruling clan. And the motifs that may have originated in the ancient Near East could have entered the Tangut cultural sphere via the Silk Road, but it requires further investigation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for an amazing lecture. And now we have some time for questions.
You can hear me?
Yes?
So, like, Tangut is a Mongolian word, but in the Tibetan and Tangut people, they call themselves like Minya. Like, Red Annals is like, so Minya is referred to Tangut, but Minya is very like, it's a multiple meaning words means like Minya people, their language, and sense of error. Now in Tibet, like Western Sichuan, there is a place called, traditional Tibetan people call Minyasekan. And now there are some like Minya people, Tibetans consider them as like Tangut people. They are like after the Tangut empire, like destroyed sea, and under the sea there is a forest, and but he's not under the forest. He's about the fire. So I think also some like Tibetan scholars, Chinese scholars, they always say like, okay, maybe today Minya people, I mean not the Minya era people, like Minya people who like speak the Minya language. Maybe they are the they are the like the Tangut people they were from the original country. So do you think there is like any relationship between these Minya and or like Shishan time?
Oh, it's a very complex question because I read about the history of Minya before they created their own state, and there were Minya that lived closer to the Tibetans and Minya that joined Chinese, and I tend to think about the term itself as an ethnonym that they applied to themselves. And it is very probable that Minya that are living nowadays in Kham, they are descendants of the same Minya, and they could share some the same narratives also with the Tanguts. But I don't know that much about it, but what you told is very interesting, and I would like to know more about the folk narratives about of Minya in Kham.
Also, like from the linguistics perspective, we think nowadays Minya language is very close to
Gelrong?
Tangut, like okay, Minya people also nowadays Minya people like us we call ourselves the Minya, and also like some languages numbers or after so many words. Some people say like I forgot where I read it. So like say 30% is like same.
Mhm.
There's a language like the words mumi, this word like nowadays Minya, but the language is also in but it means like cow and the mother. Maybe they have some connection like yeah, because the history suddenly disappeared in the culture. So in the future.
Yes, I do. As far as I know, linguistically, the Tangut is closer of all to the Gelrongic family of group of languages, but it has no no close living no closely living languages that could be compared to it. Mhm.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah,
So, Axel, may I kindly ask you to come closer because
Yes, okay.
our listeners in Zoom can't hear the discussion.
So you said that after the destruction of the Tangut Empire in the 13th century, there was about 3 centuries before the final disappearance of the Tangut people. So how many sources do we have about this period of disappearance of the Tangut people?
As I said, the Chinese dynastical history, they deal with the existence of the Tangut state, and about the Tanguts that lived in the times of Yuan and Sun. We can learn only occasionally from the literary sources that they left behind them, for example, the translations that they made or any activities at the court. So we don't have any voluminous accounts of their life after the Tangut state was destroyed.
In the very first slide where you presented the history, like this timeline, you put the date from 6th to 9th century. And I'm wondering why such a discrepancy when, for example, the son of the first king, he like it's known that like it's dated 11th century, for example, because the year of 1006. But why is such discrepancy between 6 and 9?
Toba Sagun lived in the 9th century, and his son Toba Dziecian in the 10th century. I didn't highlight it.
Okay, because I was like thinking that they were like one of them like they were born in between 6th and 9th century, and this probably is not known like exact date, but still discrepancy of 3 centuries. And
No, it is related to the period of time when the Dansan tribes emerged, and its like apex point was when Toba Sagun gained partial independence from the Sun.
And the second question was regarding the archaeological excavations. I'm wondering whether you know maybe some other archaeological excavation has happened except this one in the Black City, made by this Russian archaeologist. Maybe in modern time, I don't know, Chinese side or some Western side is trying to reveal some new sites.
Yes, surely there are very important sites in the city of Inchuan, the capital of Ningxia province, where the tombs, mausoleums of the Tangut emperors are situated. Also, there are tombs in the Alashan Helan mountains. These mountains are considered to be the legendary motherland of the Tanguts, and many objects of art and ruins of the buildings are being excavated in this area. And of course, Chinese archaeologists are doing their best on all the territory of the former Tangut state, mainly Gansu, Qinghai, and of course Ningxia province and Inner Mongolia. If anyone in Zoom online has questions, please raise your hand or write in chat. What's better? Yes, but what can I do?
They can use the chat or just unmute themselves.
Hello, my name is Jagal Badagarov, and yeah, thanks a lot for this fascinating talk. I have a question concerning the role of Toktobod Majapov, you mentioned him, and I'm very happy to see him mentioned because he's not mentioned often, right? He often actually stays unmentioned from the whole history. And we know that he actually sent his report about initial excavations and asked Kozlov, whom he called his friend, to publish this report. And I wonder if this report can be found. Is it available? Personally, I've never seen it, and maybe you know something about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jergal. It is definitely true that it was Badmajapov who was the first to obtain the information about the site of Harahoto, though he did not visit it himself. He passed this information to to Petr Kozlov, and Petr Kozlov behaved himself completely unethically, because when he received all his honors for this discovery, he completely neglected the contribution of Tsakhtobut Majapov to this one of the greatest discoveries in the history of the 20th century. I don't know the fate of the report, but I will look into it. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions or difference?
I have another question, possibly, about the name of these forefathers, right? Of the forefathers, Silhu or Gahu. I wonder if there is an explanation why these two variants exist. While this Silhu seems to be kind of cognate to this Sigung in Chinese, do we know anything about Gahu? What is the reason of this kind of duplicate name? Thank you.
There is a issue with reading a Tangut character, because there are two Tangut characters that are read very similarly, but has completely different transcription and pronunciation, and probably that could be. This discrepancy and two different names could have derived from the problems with reading characters, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Thank you.